Welcome. My name is Jeff Summit. I'm the executive director of Tufts Hillel and rabbi and Jewish chaplain on campus. Dr. Munzer, we're so glad that you're here this evening. President Monaco, our dear friends, Bill and Joyce Cummings, who have established our Cummings Hillel program on Holocaust and genocide education. We're so happy to have people here. As I was telling many of our students, were just at a time, even though Dr. Munzer is a young man, but so many of the survivors, we're getting to the point where it's just so important to be able to be here and hear people and hear people's story. So you'll be able to tell your children, honestly, that you were in the presence of people who survived the Holocaust. Before we start our program, I want to reflect on how hard and important it is to listen to the stories we'll be hearing this evening. Those of us who have studied the Holocaust, and those of us like myself whose families perished in the Holocaust, some of the family survived, a lot of the family didn't, like so many people here, and people who've been affected by contemporary genocide, and we have people here with us tonight who are survivors of contemporary genocide. We're so deeply impacted by what we learn. So many of these stories are heartbreaking. So I want to share a quote from a Sufi mystic, Hazrat Inayat Khan. And I was thinking about this. I heard this quote about 2 weeks ago, and I've been thinking about it constantly. Here's the quote: God breaks the heart again and again and again until finally our heart stays open. God breaks our hearts again and again and again until finally our heart stays open. Dr. Munzer, I hope when we listen to your words this evening, we'll listen with an open heart, and an open heart that moves us to action. The stories that we'll hear this evening recount a time that took incredible strength and courage for people who resisted and people who saved victims. But as we read the papers and as we study in our classes now, we understand that in each generation, there are times that call for moral courage. And at this time that we're living in now, a time of political division, a global refugee crisis, an increasingly contentious dialogue in our country, and a time when, if you followed the news last week, political parties in France most recently denied their country's historic responsibility for the Holocaust. Each of us must pledge to be active and engaged citizens. It's not enough to learn this material. We have to operationalize moral courage by what we decide to study, by choosing to raise important issues that are large and uncomfortable in our conversations, by the work we do in community, by how we allocate our resources, by the serious volunteer and civic engagement that we do. We must never forget the Holocaust, but the lessons of the Holocaust and the lessons of contemporary genocides have to move us to change and repair the world that we encounter today. I really believe this is the kind of education we're engaged in at Tufts University and at Tufts Hillel. Education that's committed to the university having an impact for good in our world, something that our President Monaco, talks about often. While the Cummings Hillel program hosts this keynote lecture, this amazing program, and through the work of our Assistant Director, Lauren Bloom, and the amazing students who she works with, don't only sponsor this program, but sponsor genocide education throughout the year. And this May, with Bill and Joyce's support, we'll send a large group of an interfaith group of students from Tufts to the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village in Rwanda to learn from students and teachers there who have survived the Rwandan genocide. When our students return, they commit to continuing education and activism on campus. If you're interested in this trip, please talk to any one of us, and it would be wonderful to have you engaged and involved. And the Cummings Hillel program did an interfaith trip to the to the U.S. Holocaust Museum that was incredible this year, and a whole range of other programs. So really good things are happening. Dr. Muenzer, we're so appreciative that you're here with us this evening, and I'll turn it over to our Cummings Hillel Fellow, Aviva Weinstein, to introduce you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Summit. And good evening. My name is Aviva Weinstein, and I'm an intern with the Cummings Hillel Program for Holocaust and Genocide Education at Tufts. I'm humbled and honored to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Alfred Muenzer. There's much that could be said about the persistence of human atrocity around the globe. Genocide and hatred still plague our world. Sadly, the lessons of World War II are as vital today as they were 70 years ago. Incredibly, there are still world leaders who seek to rewrite or erase the history of the Holocaust. Their role in creating cultures of intolerance and hatred make them no better than those who perpetrate violence. Tonight, we have an opportunity to better understand our role in addressing hatred of the other. Tonight, we are privileged to hear about the strength of righteousness in the face of evil and to learn from a story of remarkable bravery and love for the stranger. The words and wisdom that Dr. Muenzer will share with us tonight are not just inspiring. They speak directly to us as members of the international community who care about the plight of those who live under genocidal regimes. Dr. Muenzer's experience as a witness and survivor are not simply a historic record. They can and should compel us to act in the present day. As Dr. Muenzer noted in a recent presentation with Syrian immigrant and activist Muaz Mustafa, the tragedy of the Holocaust extends even beyond the incomprehensible loss of 6 million Jews. It haunts us today because we see genocide in our own generation. We must not turn our backs, as so many countries did in World War II. The international community has a sacred responsibility to use our resources to protect and provide for the innocent victims of today's genocides. Tonight, we are fortunate enough to hear from Dr. Muenzer, who is a leader in speaking out against contemporary genocides. Dr. Muenzer was born in November 1941 in the Netherlands. Dr. Muenzer's parents found safety for him with the Madna family, who kept him together with their 3 children. Tole Madna, originally from Indonesia, cared for Dr. Muenzer for 3 years. After the war, in 1958, Dr. Muenzer and his mother immigrated to the US together to build new lives. Today, Dr. Muenzer resides in Washington, D.C., and he practiced medicine in the field of pulmonology. And for the past 8 years, he has been a volunteer at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Muenzer has been invited to share his story around the world, including in Indonesia. He is still in touch with Tole's children. We are deeply honored that he is joining us here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Muenzer.
Well, I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to see everybody here tonight. It is a tremendous honor for me to be at Tufts to speak with you. As you heard, I am a physician, a pulmonologist. I actually served as president of the American Lung Association, and I'm very much accustomed to public speaking. I love to talk about the dangers of smoking, treatment of tuberculosis, air pollution, and all of those things really come quite easy. But tonight I'm going to talk about something that's more difficult. I'm going to talk about something that is much closer to my heart, and that is the story of my family during the Holocaust. I can't tell you what happened to 6 million Jews and countless other victims of the Nazis. All I can tell you tonight is what happened to one small family. But multiply the story I tell you about this one family 1 million times over to get a picture of what the Holocaust was all about and what lessons the Holocaust continues to hold for us today. And I'll begin by showing you this particular photograph. And Usually I'm accustomed to asking for volunteers as to, identifying this woman. But you've already heard that this woman happens to be Indonesian. She was born in Indonesia came to Holland in the early 1900s. Very, very poor woman, illiterate, spoke no Dutch, couldn't read or write. But this remarkable woman is holding a little baby. And usually I ask people, who do you think the baby is? And of course, to you, it's already obvious. I am the baby. And so I'm going to tell you a story how it was that this woman, born in Indonesia, came to save the life of this little baby, 9 months old at the time, so that that baby could stand before you tonight and tell the story of his family. I'll begin by telling you a little bit about my parents. My parents were born in a part of the world that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the First World War. My father was born in a small town called Kanczuga, which is now part of Poland. And, my mother in a neighboring town called Rymanov. And we have sort of a caricaturish image of these little towns, these little shtetls, perhaps from having seen too many versions of Fiddler on the Roof. But in actual fact, one of the people who came from my mother's hometown, from Rymanov, was a man by the name of Isidor Rabi. Isidor Rabi came to the United States, became a physicist, and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1946 for the discovery of electromagnetism. And so here you have it, a tremendous brain coming from one of those little towns that were totally decimated, of course, by the Nazis, which leads you to worry and to think as to how many brains, how many Nobel Prize winners are found among the ashes of Auschwitz and Belzec, for example. This is a picture of my grandparents with my little cousin, Yossi, who was visiting there. His parents had actually left Rymanov and went to Berlin. And my parents, when they were about 18 years old, also left their homes. My father went directly to the Netherlands, where he started a men's clothing business. My mother left her hometown, left Rymanov, to join her older siblings who were living in Berlin. Berlin was really the big go-to city for young people to go to and to escape anti-Semitism and really the narrow-mindedness of these tiny towns and lack of opportunities. Well, my mother arrived in Berlin in the 1920s, just about the same time that Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, was being published. But frankly, my mother was 18 years old. She had no great interest in politics, and she certainly wasn't interested in reading Mein Kampf. She was much more interested in playing with my two little cousins, my cousin Norbert, my cousin Yossi, whom you met earlier, and Norbert's mother, my aunt Helen. And my mother remained in Berlin with her siblings until 1932, the end of 1932. The end of 1932, when my mother joined my father in Holland, where they were married, is almost the exact same time that Adolf Hitler approached the aging president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, and asked him to be made Chancellor of Germany, which really started the Nazi era. So here you have it, a very happy occasion, a wedding taking place just a few hundred miles away from Berlin, from, the Nazi capital, if you will. Well, Holland, Jews had lived in Holland for hundreds of years. They were totally integrated into all segments of Dutch society, in the arts, government, professions. And so, Jews felt very, very comfortable. And my parents made many, many friends in Holland, most of them, frankly, not Jewish. And my father's business flourished. And in July 1936, my parents celebrated the birth of their first child, and that was my sister Eva. July 1936 was also the time of the infamous Berlin Olympics, which Adolf Hitler turned into an instrument of Nazi propaganda. So again, a happy occasion, and just a few hundred miles away, the progress, the progression, if you will, of the Nazi era happening in Germany. The next, this is another picture of my sister Eva when she was about 6 months old. The next major turning point in Germany occurred during the night of November 9th or 10th, 1938. The events that we call Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass. And whatever Jews remained in Germany, of course, desperately tried to leave. And among the last ones to leave was my mother's brother, who lived in Berlin, with his little son, my little cousin Norbert again. And here is Norbert's mother, my Aunt Helen again, whom you met earlier, leaving for one of the very few places in the world that was still willing to take in Jewish refugees, Bolivia, South America, one of the poorest countries in the world. And there they had to start a whole new life in this poor country. And to this day, I still have relatives living in Bolivia. In fact, a few months ago, we celebrated the wedding of my uncle's great-grandson, but still in Bolivia. 3 days after Kristallnacht, 3 days after the night of broken glass, November 12, 1938, my mother gave birth to her second child, and that was my sister Leah. Another happy event while the Nazi era really is progressing, getting much, much worse. Well, not all Jews who were in Germany were able to find refuge in a faraway country like my mother's brother, my uncle Abraham or Adolf. And some of them just managed to cross the border from Germany into Holland. And among those was my uncle Emil, my father's brother, who now joined our family. And, the family tried to go on living. And here you have, my Uncle Emil holding my little sister Leah, my mother holding my sister Eva, or my father holding my sister Eva, and my mother sitting in the middle, trying to enjoy a normal day in the park, having a picnic probably. While, again, all these terrible events are happening just across the border. The next big turning point occurred May 10th, 1940. That particular night, my parents had been asked to host a man who was a member of the Dutch resistance movement. He had a briefcase with him in which he carried plans to preemptively destroy the big railroad center in the city of Utrecht. It was felt that if the railroad center were destroyed, it would slow down any invasion coming from Germany. But that morning, my parents and their guest listened to the radio, and they heard that the port city of Rotterdam had been bombed and destroyed. And a few minutes later, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands came on the radio and announced that Holland had surrendered. And she asked people to do their duty everywhere, wherever they happened to find themselves. It was my parents' guest who was the first to speak up, this man from the Dutch resistance movement. And his words in Dutch were, "Goddank, het is ten einde." Thank God, it's over. As far as he was concerned, he had tried to do what he could to stop any invasion from Germany. And now he would have to accommodate to living under an occupation. But my parents, looking at their two little kids, perhaps in a playpen just like this, knew what had happened to their relatives in Poland and in Germany. and they knew that things were going to be very rough and that they were going to be all alone. And in fact, within a very short period of time, all of the restrictions that had been placed on Jews in Germany and in Austria over many years were put in place in Holland in just a matter of days. First of all, Jews had to register as Jews. Jewish men had to take a new middle name, Israel. Jewish women, a new middle name, Sarah, so they could always be identified as being Jewish. Jewish property had to be registered. And Jews were also prohibited from using public transportation and from going into public parks. Now, when you have a regulation that makes very little sense, like being prohibited from going into a public park, you tend to ignore it. And that's what my mother did, and she continued to take the baby carriage with my little sister Leah into a neighboring park, a park that actually adjoins the Peace Palace, the Vredespaleis in The Hague. And one day, a German woman approached the baby's carriage. And my mother told me that her heart almost stopped because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. And then the woman looked at the baby carriage, looked at my little sister, and she saw blonde curls and blue eyes. And she turned to my mother and she said, you can tell that this is good German Aryan blood. Well, my mother thanked the woman and, of course, left the park and never went back there again. In fact, she had a phobia of that park and wouldn't even go there after the war. Well, my parents tried to go on with normal lives even during the occupation. So for my mother's birthday, a whole series of photographs were taken of the family. This is what a selfie looked like in the 1930s. And my sister Eva doing a little dance for the photographer. But this was also the time when my parents found out, or my mother found out, that she was pregnant again. And she consulted an obstetrician who told her in no uncertain terms that she should have an abortion. He told her that it would be immoral to bring another Jewish life into the world. Another big dilemma for the family. And my mother wasn't particularly religious, but at that time she consulted the Bible, the Torah, and she found her answer in the story of Hannah. Hannah was a woman who was desperate to conceive and would go to the temple every year and pray that she might have a child. And it was in reading of Hannah's agonizing desire to have a child, and Hannah's pledge, if the Almighty will give me a child, I will give that child to the service of God all of the days of his or her life. In reading that, my mother decided that she couldn't possibly have an abortion. Her obstetrician fired her as a patient, and so 9 months later, I was born at home with the help of a nurse. And this brought about another dilemma in Jewish life, because traditionally, Jewish baby boys are circumcised, have a bris, when they're 8 days old. And my parents' friends said, don't have him circumcised. It will identify him as being Jewish. Well, this time the answer to my parents' dilemma came in the form of a worried look on the face of a pediatrician who had just examined me. And my father turned to the pediatrician and asked him, is there anything wrong with the baby? And the pediatrician said, no, it's just that your little boy needs a minor operation that we call a circumcision. And so my father told them of our Jewish tradition, and 8 days later, the family gathered in our living room for probably one of the last such ceremonies held in Holland during the occupation. One little sister, my other little sister, all gathered around the dining room table, and I'm here somewhere on this pillow. What makes these photographs very special is that they're only about 1 by 1.5 inch in size. And my mother was to keep those 2 small photographs hidden on her body through her stay in 12 concentration camps. My mother developed this feeling, this superstition, that if she ever lost those photographs, it would mean that I had been killed. Fortunately, my mother survived, the photographs survived, and I survived. And of course, those photographs are so valuable, so special, that I did not even want to keep them in the house. And they are now part of the collection of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Well, here's another picture of me with my 2 little sisters. And I don't know, I'll take anyone's guess as to how old I'm in this picture. I would say probably 7, 8 months old, something like that. So this is the time when my parents were faced with yet another dilemma. Because this is when Jewish men were beginning to get notices to report for so-called labor duty. And they knew that that meant being sent to a concentration camp. Concentration camps first in Holland, and then, of course, with a good chance of being sent east to Germany, or worse, to Poland. And so this is a time when Jews made the decision to go into hiding. Now, some Jewish families in Holland, like the famous Anne Frank family, went into hiding as one family unit. You know, they hid basically in the famous attic in Amsterdam. My parents decided that as a form of insurance, to make sure that at least one member might survive, even if the others were taken, that we would split up. And so my parents made plans for us to be hidden in different places. The first one to go into hiding was actually my father. He pretended to commit an act of suicide, and that gained him admission to a psychiatric hospital called the Remarkliniek near The Hague. And then the next ones to be placed were my 2 sisters. A woman, who was a very devout Catholic woman, had a dream in which she saw the Virgin telling her to take Jewish children into hiding. She told her priest about that, and the priest told my parents' neighbors, my aunt, the woman I always called my Aunt Jo, she really wasn't my aunt, but that's what I called her, who was Catholic, a very devout Catholic, and she told my parents about this woman. And so my parents entrusted my 2 little sisters to the care of that woman. And here you have my 2 little sisters participating in a procession in a Catholic school, assuming their new Catholic identity. Jewish baby boys were more difficult to place, and my mother told me that, she was left all alone in our house. My father was in hiding, the 2 sisters had been placed, and then she was left all alone in the house on Zoutmanstraat with just this one little baby left to be placed. My mother told me that she was so scared of the Germans, the Nazis, coming to the house. She was so afraid of the doorbell ringing that she actually dampened the doorbell with some cloth to make sure it wouldn't make any noise. And then she told me she would spend the whole night sitting on the stairs watching the clapper of the doorbell to see if it was ringing. That's how scared she was. Well, finally, a neighbor of my mother's, a woman by the name of Annie Madna, agreed to take me in. And so my mother took me over to Annie, and then she closed the house on Zoutmanstraat where we had all been raised and lived for the last time. And she joined my father in the same psychiatric hospital where he was in hiding, in her case, pretending to be a nurse. Well, Annie Madna had some bad run-ins with the Nazis, with the Nazi occupiers, and she got scared. So she passed me on to her sister. Then it turned out that the sister had a neighbor who was a member of the Dutch Nazi Party, the NSB. And so she got scared. She thought, well, he might hear a baby crying and he would wonder, what's this strange baby doing in her house? So she passed me back to Annie Madna. And then finally, Annie Madna passed me on to her ex-husband. She was divorced, and her former husband, a man by the name of Tole Madna, is the one who agreed to take me in. Initially, the plan was for me to just be with him temporarily. But it turned out that the family took such a liking to having a little baby around that I ended up staying there for 3.5 years. Tole Madna was also born in Indonesia. He too came to Holland in the early 1900s, but he was more educated, spoke the Dutch language, and so he got a job managing an Indonesian restaurant. And he had one guest worker there, a young woman from Indonesia, very poor, uneducated, like any of the immigrants coming to the United States today. And her name was Mima Saina. And she would do just ordinary kitchen work in the restaurant. But he realized that she was a really good woman, and so he hired her to take care of his children, to become the nanny for his kids. And her name was Mima Saina. And she is the woman I mentioned to you at the very beginning of my talk. A woman illiterate, couldn't read or write, but a woman with a heart of gold. This is a picture of her with the 3 Madna children taken 10 years before I joined the Madna household. And I joined the household through these 3 children, actually 10 years older. And here's the same photograph that I showed you earlier of Mima holding me. Mima had to walk miles every day just to get milk for me, because I was in the house illegally, and so there were no ration coupons for me. So any food, people had to just scrounge around. And actually, a few years ago, I was in Holland, and a woman approached me, and she said, you used to drink my milk. And I asked her, what do you mean? And she said, well, all school children in Holland during the war years were given a little bottle of milk. And my mother told me to save half that little bottle for the baby next door. And you were the baby next door. So here you have it, a little 8-year-old kid contributing to saving a human life. Really important lesson. I slept in Mima's bed, and she kept a knife under her pillow, I'm told, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me. But the memories that I have of being with the Madna household, the few memories that I have, are all very good ones. I remember listening to Papa Madna playing on the piano. And I do remember that periodically, for some bizarre reason, I would have to go into a little cellar that they would close. And then I played in there with the Christmas decorations of the family. And that's, of course, when the house was being searched by the Nazis. My foster father, Papa Madna, had some excuses that he gave the Nazis as to why there was this Caucasian child in his household. He told the Nazis, the officers who came to the house, that I was the illegitimate child of his ex-wife, and that she had a new boyfriend who did not want me around. One of the many stories that he actually made up as time went by to explain the presence of a child that looked very, very different from the rest of the family. I also remember that towards the end of the war, there was tremendous hunger. There was very, very little food. The only thing that was left were ground up tulip bulbs. And one memory I have is seeing the table being set, all the plates on the table, and thinking that we were going to be fed. So I sat down at my chair, my regular seat, and fell asleep with my head falling in the plate, and that's how they found me the following morning. Also one of those few memories that I have. Another picture of Papa Madna. I should mention a previous picture, you have my foster sister Devi in the middle, Willie on the left, and then there's a little dog. Well, Jewish children who went into hiding were given a new name, and I was given the name Bobby. And to this day, when I correspond with the Madna family, they still call me Bobby. And I have to remember, that's what I am. And for many, many years, I thought I was called Bobby after the little dog. The reason being that if people heard Bobby being called, they said, well, they're just calling the dog, you know. They're not calling any strange little baby who's in hiding over there. So just about 2 years ago, I shared that story with the woman in the middle, Devi Madna, who's now 87 years old. And I told her the story. And she said, you're absolutely wrong. The dog's name was Teddy, not Bobby. So there went, you know, that whole theory. In actual fact, the reason I was called Bobby was probably after this little boy over here, who was the third of the Madna children, Rob Madna or Robbie Madna. And Robbie and Bobby are very close to the same theory. People would hear Bobby being called, and they would say, well, I'm just calling Robbie. So Robbie Madna actually became a mathematician, then gave up his career as a math teacher and became a jazz pianist, and finally head of the Netherlands Jazz Orchestra. A fabulous musician and really one of my dearest, dearest friends over a lifetime. Another picture of Papa Madna holding me with Mima to the side. And sometimes what's on the back of the photograph is really interesting because here it says, here is Mima and my son, Bob. And because for the rest of his life, Papa Madna, as I called him, until he passed away, always considered me his son. Well, we left my parents in hiding in that psychiatric hospital. My mother a nurse, my father pretending to be a patient. But that really only lasted about 2 months. My parents were allowed one visit with my two little sisters for Christmas Day, 1942. But then New Year's Day, 1943, the entire hospital was emptied of all staff and patients, and they were all sent to concentration camps. First to Westerbork in Holland, and then from Westerbork, my parents were sent on to another camp in Holland called Vught, where they were assigned to do slave labor for the Philips Electronics factory. And my mother told me that every morning, all of the prisoners would have to line up. And one day, there was a special speaker who addressed the prisoners. And his name was Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's second in command. And he exhorted the prisoners, and he said, if you continue to work for the success of the Reich, nothing bad will ever happen to you. But my mother told me that during that speech, she spotted the spire of a small Dutch church way off in the distance. And she said it would be so wonderful if peace were to break out at that moment and she could run to that church, fall on her knees, and thank God for having been freed. She didn't care whether it was a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, just a place to thank God for having been freed. But her wish wasn't to come true, and Heinrich Himmler did not keep his promise, and just 3 months later, the entire prison camp at Vught was emptied, and all of the prisoners were sent on to Auschwitz. And that's where my parents were separated. My father remained in Auschwitz for about 6 months, then went on to a whole series of other camps. And my mother was immediately taken from Auschwitz to another camp in a place called Reichenbach. And there she continued to do work in the electronics area. She worked for the Telefunken electronics factory, assembling radio tubes. She had learned through the grapevine that they were essential to the German war effort and that they might be a key to her survival, which they were. And my mother told me that she worked alongside German soldiers who had been repatriated from the Eastern Front, who were minus an arm or a leg because they had been severely injured and were no longer fit for duty, so they were assigned to work in the electronics factory. And she said those men had become so anti-Hitler that they did everything possible to sabotage the workings of the factory. And so my mother told me she engaged in little acts of sabotage herself. She would spend a whole day assembling one small radio tube, and then at the end of the day, when the siren was sounded, she would take it apart and put the parts of the radio tube in a drawer and start the process all over again the following day. Another act of defiance that my mother told me about at Reichenbach, which I've since read about in another article actually, was the continued observance of Jewish holidays. So this was Hanukkah. And so some of the women went to the infirmary and told the nurse that they were having their menstrual period and asked for wads of cotton. And then they would take these wads of cotton, fashion them into wicks, and then take a potato and some of the oil from the machines they were worked on, and at night, in the evening, they would light those wicks to celebrate Hanukkah, to keep the light burning, if you will. And it's one of the reasons, I think, these acts of defiance, these spiritual acts and physical acts, that really kept my mother alive. My mother witnessed the bombing of the Telefunken factory by the Allies, and she told me that when she saw the factory going up in flames, she recited the Jewish prayer of thanks, the Shehecheyanu prayer, for having lived and survived to see the day when that factory of evil was going up in flames. But that wasn't the end of my mother's ordeal, because just like many other prisoners, as Elie Wiesel described, they were then transported, put on death marches closer and closer west as the Soviet army approached. They were called death marches because so many people succumbed during those marches. And my mother finally came, after a whole series of camps, arrived at the Danish border, and that's where she was liberated through the intervention of Count Folke Bernadotte, head of the Swedish Red Cross, together with several thousand other women. This was early in 1945, and she was then sent on to Sweden to recuperate. Well, the story of my two sisters, sadly, is not at all the same as mine. The husband of the family where my sisters were in hiding denounced his wife as hiding two Jewish children. So his wife was put in prison, eventually freed, but my two sisters were immediately taken to Auschwitz and killed. And they were only 6 and 8 years old. This is page 137 of people deported to Auschwitz from Holland. And here you can see one of my sisters and the other little sisters. The names have been changed because they too took on different names while they were in hiding. This is the death certificate issued by the Red Cross on one of my sisters, indicating that they were killed February 11th, 1944. And it's only in recent years, really, that I have begun to feel the loss of my two sisters. Well, I was reunited with my mother in August 1945. That's when she came back to Holland from Sweden. And that's the first very clear memory that I have. I remember being asleep in one of the back rooms of the house, and one of my foster sisters coming over to get me and carry me into the living room where the whole family was sitting in a circle. And I was crying, cranky. I wasn't happy about having been awakened. And all I remember is being passed from lap to lap, and that there was one lap I wouldn't sit in, and a woman I kept pushing away, and that, of course, was my own mother, who was a total stranger to me, because I already had a mother, and that was Mima Saina. My mother realized that it would be very, very difficult to separate me from Mima. And so she made a plan for Mima to continue to care for me while my mother, went out looking for work. And my mother told me that, just to get me used to being alone with her, she gave Mima some tickets to go to a movie one evening. And 5 minutes, Mima left the house, and 5 minutes later she came back and she wagged her finger at my mother and she said, "Don't hit him." That's how protective Mima was of me, that she did not even trust my own mother to take care of me. And that lasted, sadly, only about 2 months, because in October 1945, Mima had a cerebral hemorrhage and passed away. And I really have almost no memories, very, very few memories of Mima Saina all I remember is visiting her grave, which I did many, many times, so much so that when I went back to Holland many years later, I was able to find the grave almost immediately when Papa Matna took me there, because I had been there, so many times before. I haven't told you about my father yet. He remained, as I said, in Auschwitz for about 6 months. And, just a few months ago, I found a little piece of paper with his number as a prisoner in Auschwitz and a signature on it. And then it said premium employee, no name, just premium employee. So I asked the researcher at the Holocaust Museum what this meant. And he said, the factories that employed slave labor had to pay the wages of the slave labor to the SS, and your father was a premium employee and warranted a higher wage. Just an indication of the tremendous bureaucracy that was created by the Nazis. Well, after Auschwitz, my father went to Mauthausen. Mauthausen, a camp where prisoners were forced to carry 46-pound boulders up a ramp, and very often would be tripped, so much so that 100,000 people, 100,000 prisoners died in Mauthausen just from maltreatment. This was not a death center. And from there on, he went to 3 more camps, Gusen, Steyr, and then finally a camp called Ebensee, high up in the Austrian Alps. How many of you have seen the movie, blocking on it? Anyway, this is where The Sound of Music, sorry. How many of you have seen The Sound of Music? Okay, almost everybody. Well, Ebensee is where The Sound of Music was filmed. It's one of the most beautiful spots in the world. And there, in this beautiful spot, there was a concentration camp where prisoners were forced to assemble V-2 rockets in abandoned salt mines. Absolutely terrible work. My father survived to see liberation by the US Army, but sadly he passed away just a few months later, July 25th, 1945. So I was never reunited with my father, and he's buried in the concentration camp cemetery. Most of the prisoners there, for a while there was a cross on his grave. We don't know why, but that was removed eventually. Now there really are no markings at all at the present time, because people really did not know what religion the prisoners belonged to. Well, in Holland, my mother had to start life over again. I started elementary school, and she acquired a cosmetics store, and here we are in front of the store, was able to make a living that way. And Jewish life started over again in Holland. And here's a picture taken on Purim, when Jewish kids dress up in costumes. And on the far right, you can see me over here, dressed up as a collection box for the Jewish National Fund. And that was my mother's contribution to the Purim festival. And I won first prize with this costume. I remained in close touch with Papa Matna. This is a picture taken very shortly after the war. I'm here. He tried to bring a little bit of Indonesia into Holland and to his backyard. So he kept chickens in his backyard. And when my mother and I left for the United States, he came to see us off. He remarried. He had 3 more kids. And the only time the 3 kids from the first family and from the second family came together was when I was there. I was a bridge always between those 2 families, those 2 sets of kids. And here's my picture, my graduation picture from college, and next to it, my graduation picture from medical school on Papa's piano, because he always, as I said, considered me part of his family. Picture in front of the house where I was hidden, and some pictures with others in the Matna family. And this is the very last picture taken with Papa Matna. I saw him about 2 months before he passed away. And people told me that he kept himself alive because he wanted to see his son from America one last time. And his final words to me were, take care of your mother. Because that's the kind of person he was. Concerned about the other person, never concerned about himself. You know, people asked him, why did you take this tremendous risk to have a Jewish baby hidden in your family? A risk to yourself and to the others in your family. And his answer was a very simple one. What else was I to do? To him, there was simply no question. That is really what he needed to do. My favorite picture of Papa Matna. And the Matna family has now been honored at Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, the only two names that have the word Indonesia after their names. And I share the story with Papa Matna's grandchildren, great-grandchildren, because I all want them to feel proud of the tremendous thing that their grandfather and great-grandfather did. And then a few years ago, I had a chance to share the story with a group of students from Indonesia, an amazing experience, because they knew very little about the Holocaust, almost nothing. They really hadn't met anyone Jewish before. And at the very end of my talk, just the same talk that I gave you tonight, they said, I told them, I said, you know, I have no memories of Mima except that she used to sing a lullaby to me. And it's called Nina Bobo. I see you shaking your head. Nina Bobo. And all of these students suddenly started singing Nina Bobo in unison. An amazing experience. And after that, young women in headscarves, traditional Muslim women from Indonesia, came up to me, hugged me, and said, we are family. And that to me is really the message that I tried to convey, is the one lesson from the Holocaust that we never ought to forget, that we are all part of one human family. Told a story in Indonesia. Here's another picture of me in Indonesia. And then a few years ago, someone had the very wonderful idea of inviting me to a Holocaust commemorative event like tonight, and pairing me with a child survivor of another genocide, An Chorn Pond, a survivor of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And the two of us bonded so much so that over 3 days, he started telling my story and I started telling his story of survival. He survived the Khmer Rouge as a prisoner, as a 10-year-old, by playing music for his captors, music that they would amplify to cover the sound of the skulls of their prisoners being cracked. And then he finally escaped and eventually came to the United States, and he is now very much at the forefront of bringing healing and reconciliation to Cambodia through the use, especially of the arts and music, and we've become very, very good friends. And in the end, that's the story that I'm left with, is that out of all of this evil in the Holocaust, which we all know about, we all hear about, but the lesson that I take away, that there were people like the Matna family who were able to stand up in the midst of all this evil and to continue to do what is right. That, I think, is something that all of us, the lesson that I want to convey and leave everybody with tonight. Thank you.
You'll take some questions?
Absolutely.
I'm happy to moderate the questions, but we have a microphone here. And sure, who would like to, let's do it this way. We're going to put this here and there, and if anybody has a question, please just come up to the microphone to ask. That's the easiest way. Please. It's like always the first person.
There's a question, okay.
If you speak really loud. not loud enough.
Thank you for sharing your story and for welcoming us into your past and into your present. I'm wondering, what was the story behind why that man revealed that he was taking care of your sisters? After so many years, why did he let the tragedy, come upon them?
I really have no idea. Until a few years ago, I did not even know the name of the family where my sisters were hidden. For some reason, I never asked my mother the name of the family. All I know is that my mother, after the war, she took me over to visit the woman who had hidden my sisters, because she wanted the woman to know that at least one of the children had survived, and that my mother appreciated that the woman had made the effort to save my sisters. I've recently actually been in correspondence with some people in Holland, where they're still investigating some of the war crimes, like the one committed by this man who denounced my sisters. But at the moment, I really don't have a good answer as to what happened, why this happened, whether this was just in a fit of rage. I don't know. One of the questions that I'm often asked is really, how did I find out about what happened to my sisters? So, anyone want to ask that question?
Sure. Please.
I'll answer the question, because that's really an important part of the story. So I grew up, as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, with the Holocaust all around me. I would walk with my mother, take walks in the evening through fields of rubble, because part of our city had been bombed and destroyed. I thought that was the most normal thing. I thought, playing hide and seek in bunkers on the beach was just a normal activity. And many of my childhood friends were minus parents, brothers or sisters. And then, my mother's friends, this Aunt Jo that I mentioned, she would show me books that my little sister Eva could read when she was 6 years old. They were actually Catholic catechism books. But, and I would, and then she would show me notebooks where my sister had written, and a beautiful handwriting that I felt I could never match. And so I grew up initially actually being jealous of my 2 little sisters, not realizing that they had been killed. What I found out first was that there were some people who had not come back, others who did come back, and some who did not. Nobody talked about surviving. It was always coming back. And I began to realize that wherever this place was, my sisters did not come back. And then gradually I came to understand what had happened to them. But that's how I began to learn very slowly about what the Holocaust was about.
When did your mom start sharing her memories with you, and what was that?
When did my mother start sharing those memories with me, and what was that like? Well, we started talking. First of all, I just wrote on Peace for, we have a writing group in the Holocaust Museum, and I just wrote an essay, and it's called Life in a Box. And the box refers to a box from my mother's cosmetic store in which she had about 100 photographs of the family. And I would be curious about those photographs, and my mother would start telling me stories about the people in the box. And that's how I began to learn, how she began to share the story of her family way back in Rimanov, and then, her wedding to my father, some of the things, funny things that happened. The rabbi who refused to officiate because the wedding band had been engraved, something that's an absolute no-no. So they had to go get a new wedding band. Little stories like that sort of stayed with me. And then other things. And then finally a story she told me, which really hit me, came really close to me, is when I entered the household, basically, and she said the whole family would be around looking at me in a playpen, grabbing it sounds like a trivial story, grabbing a large cookie in my fist and eating all around it like a baby does. And then they were watching to see what would happen. And I dropped the cookie on the floor, and I got on my knees, picked up the cookie with my fingers, and finished eating it. And they took such pride in a little baby doing something like that. And my mother told me about that. And that's how my whole family was brought to life for me. And then, of course, many, many years later, when there was the television series called Holocaust, I sat down with my mother with a map, and I asked her to tell me exactly where she was at what time during her stay in the concentration camps. And that's when I developed the whole story.
So you have managed to get a very positive outcome out of the Holocaust. I wonder, were you ever bitter about it, or did you ever feel like a victim and feel like the world was an unfair place? And how did you deal with it?
Did I ever feel any bitterness because of what had happened to my family? A couple of things. One of the things, is my mother used psychology. She never hit me or anything. I never had any physical punishment. But what she would tell me periodically is when I was bad, she would remind me of the story of Hannah and Hannah's pledge, I will give that child to the service of God all of the days of his life. And my mother would tell me, I made the same pledge when you were born, when I was pregnant with you, and you better be good. And it really, and this sounds funny, but it really did have an effect. It's the kind of thing that my mother would remind me about. And I really felt fortunate to have survived. And bitterness, interestingly enough, as I said before, it's really in recent years that I've come to fully gripping really what had happened to my sisters and what I've missed over the years. All the conversations, all of the events, that we could have, all the seders we could have been together, all of those things. It's accumulating as the years go by.
Doctor, I have a question. It's not unusual for survivors when they move to a new place to want to leave their Jewish identity behind. And I know of families who were so traumatized that they didn't even want to raise their children Jewish because they were so fearful of persecution. How did this affect your own Judaism and your own identity?
Well, certainly in the case of my mother, it actually reinforced her Jewish identity. She came from Poland, from the little shtetl, from Rimanov, where she was in a very closed Hasidic family. And like many other young Jews, she was rebelling against that when she came to Holland. And, quote, enlightened, right? But after the war, my mother became actually more religious than she had been before. And she made sure that I attended, a cheder in Holland, which wasn't easy. There were not many Jewish kids left in Holland. 80% of the Jewish population of Holland was killed. 80%. So there were, very few Jewish kids left. Interestingly enough, there was still quite a bit of anti-Semitism in Holland at the time. One of the things that I remember is standing in line with my mother to go see a movie, okay? And there was a man behind us, and he saw my mother's number from Auschwitz on her arm, and he said, there's one they didn't get. And this is, well, you can tell just the anti-Semitism that persisted in Holland after the war. After that, my mother always wore three-quarter sleeve dresses just to cover, the tattoo from Auschwitz. And I was exposed. I was certainly called dirty Jew at times in Holland. If anything, it probably reinforced my Jewish identity. A funny story is, after my mother's cosmetic store was not in a very good neighborhood, so my mother did not want me to go to the local public school, so I attended a Protestant school instead, okay? So my mother told me, she said, you know, what you learn in the morning, don't repeat in the afternoon when you go to Cheder. And it really, if anything, it instilled in me a respect, you know, for other religions. Interestingly enough, there was a man who had converted to Protestantism who came to visit my mother, and you know, and my mother, instead of him influencing her, my mother persuaded him to go to Antwerp and to buy some mezuzahs for us, which were impossible to get after the war in Holland, just to show, you know, that she really cared and to regain her Jewish identity. One of the other very early memories I have along those same lines was one of the very first observances of Pesach with my mother and some other people. And this was probably 1948, at the time of this foundation of the State of Israel and the big Israel-Arab War. And I turned to my mother, very angry, and I said, wait a minute, we just learned that all the Egyptians drowned. What happened here? They are attacking Israel. So, you know, that's one of the memories one of the things that I remember from that early Seder.
So the photos that you showed are obviously such an important part of telling the story and probably of keeping the story alive. And I was just wondering whether it was primarily your mother who went and found the photos from the places in the story that she wasn't a part of, or how you collected and kept all of those.
Well, as I said, my mother had boxes of these photographs. And, you know, she was reluctant, frankly, you know, to look at the photographs. There were some very big pictures of my sisters, my two sisters, in the house, and then all of these smaller photographs. And then gradually, she told me stories about them. And that's the stories, how I put them, I took the photographs and put them together, you know, to tell the story of my family. And it's really only a small sampling of all the photographs that I have. I'm very, very fortunate, you know, to really have all those photographs. Otherwise, I really would almost know nothing about my sisters and my family. So those photographs really, really are important. And that's why, frankly, many of those photographs now are going to the Holocaust Museum. I want to make sure that they are preserved and that other people can learn from them as well.
Maybe just one or two more questions. Yes, Mickey.
In today's world where we see all sorts of terrible things continuing to happen, and it's a much more complex world now, not to say that it wasn't complex then, what would your message be to, you know, a group of college students? You know, if I could open my door to someone on the other side of the planet, I would, but the dynamics are different. So what's your advice to do the same?
One of the advantages that we have today is that there is instant news and that we do know what's happening around the world and that we have the ability to react. And the most important thing is not to be silent, is to speak up and participate. Yes, you know, one of the things is to open our doors to refugees, but there are many other ways that we can be involved. You heard that I've gotten involved a little bit with refugees from Syria. Well, there's a small community in Arkansas. I forgot the name of the town, doesn't matter, tiny community. And that's where actually Muaz Mustafa grew up. And that community came together and adopted an orphanage in Syria. And they now send money and supplies to this orphanage that is still located in Syria, to these 20 or so kids. One community, small community, poor community in Arkansas doing that. And I think we all have an opportunity in one way or another, you know, to help. But the most important thing is not to be silent in the face of atrocities, because atrocities eventually lead to murder.
So you mentioned before that you had the chance to visit Indonesia, and I know, you know, that part of the world, Southeast Asia, hasn't always been, you know, the most religiously tolerant. So I was just curious, when you're able to visit there, what kind of reception you get. You mentioned that people aren't always aware of, the Holocaust happening, that kind of thing. So.
The reaction that I've gotten from visiting Indonesia was incredibly positive. As you said, Judaism is not an officially recognized religion in Indonesia. There is an unfortunate tendency to a more radical form of Islam in Indonesia. But nonetheless, all of the groups that I met were incredibly welcoming, terribly interested in hearing my story. I've now shared the story probably with hundreds of students from Indonesia, not counting even the ones that I spoke to in Indonesia itself, just the ones coming to the United States. And invariably, it's been a very, very positive response because, again, Indonesia itself has had a lot of internal conflicts. And so there are lessons to be learned, the fact, and again, just like those young women said, the important lesson being we are one human family. Yeah, we may have different religions, we may look a little bit different, but we really are one human family. There is a story in the Talmud, if I may borrow, Rabbi, put on my hat, and it's really the story of how to, what's the definition of dawn, okay? And because we're saying morning prayers. And one of the rabbis said, well, it's when you can tell a wild ass from a domesticated donkey, when you can tell a dog from a wolf. And the final answer that's given is when you recognize the face of your neighbor. And to me, that is really an important lesson. A new dawn depends on us being able to recognize the other, the face of our neighbor as being our neighbor, as being part of our family.
One of this year's interns with the Cummings Hillel Program on Holocaust and Genocide Education. Firstly, I want to thank you, Dr. Munzer, for this incredibly moving evening. I feel so fortunate to have been here in the audience as you shared your story with us tonight. We have a small gift from the Tufts community to show our appreciation.
Thank you.
Secondly, I want to thank Rabbi Summit for being a wonderful moderator, and Lauren Bloom, Aviva Weinstein, and the Cummings Committee for all of your efforts into making this event possible. Thank you especially to Bill and Joyce Cummings for instilling passion in students surrounding Holocaust and genocide education, and for your continued support in making Tufts a community where every student can engage meaningfully with these issues. I'd like to leave you all with a reminder of what Aviva said earlier this evening. Having the privilege to hear Dr. Munzer's experiences firsthand has given us the opportunity to learn, listen, and to humanize. And now we are responsible for acting. Let's take what Dr. Munzer has given us tonight and use it as a means for making positive change in the world. That being said, we are currently working to plan the commemoration of Yom HaShoah on April 24th. So if you are interested in getting involved in this program or genocide and Holocaust education on campus, please come speak to everyone again for coming.